Welcome back, Photoshop users. Today I am going to talk about using layers in Photoshop. And I know some of you have probably worked with layers and are comfortable with layers, but if not, hopefully this will go over some things that you haven't thought about when using layers. Alright, the first thing I want to talk about is coming up here and pulling down to panel options. And you'll see here that we have some different icon views, thumbnail views of our thumbnail previews over here. So if we turn it on small and click on OK, you'll see that we have these small previews. And some of you might like that. The older I get, the more I like to see them large. So I tend to keep them on these large thumbnail previews. We can choose to show either just the layer bounds or the entire document. So if I click on entire document, you'll see that I have all this checkerboard information back behind this masked image. That's just the entire format of the document. And if I change that to just layer bounds, which is what I tend to keep it on, it'll clip it to what we're actually looking at on that image, and it makes the information on that thumbnail preview display a little bit larger. Okay, you can use default masks on fill layers, expand new effects, and add copy to copied layers and groups if you have those checked. If you choose not to want those, then you don't have to have them checked, obviously. Expand new layer effects if we uncheck that, and we were to go down here and just create a layer effect. It's going to automatically, it won't expand that, and this is how we're going to expand those layer effects. Alright, I always go ahead, I leave those checked. And now if I come up here and create a layer effect, it should go ahead and expand it after I add that to that layer. Alright, and since we're on layer effects, how do we get rid of a layer effect if we don't want it? We just click on that layer effect and just drag it right down to the trash can. I created one down here, so I will click on that and drag it to the trash can. And there's a couple of ways we can create layer effects. We can either double click on the actual layer and it'll bring up this layer style, or we can come down here and just click on this little FX button and it'll say add layer style. And then we can interact with this layer style here. And it will go ahead and add that. We can also turn layer styles off just by clicking on the little eye here. Alright, so that's how we deal with panel options. Next thing we're going to talk about is just the simple aspects of creating a new layer, deleting a new layer, or deleting layers, and we can actually duplicate layers too. So if I want to click on this layer here, I could right click, and right click is a big feature that you're going to want to get the comfortable with. And I'll just pull up here and say duplicate layer, and we can rename that if we want to. We'll just call this test, and I'll say OK. And now you see that we have this new layer created right above our old layer. And we can delete layers. So one way to delete is to right click and say delete layer. So that's another way that we can delete. So right clicking is a good strong way to interact with your layers. Keyboard shortcut for duplicating a layer is Command J. That's kind of the old way of doing it for me. because it takes my hands off the mouse. So I've tried to get in the habit of just right clicking and seeing what that display has here for me. So I don't need that layer, so we're going to go ahead and delete. Another thing we can do with layers is rename them. So if I just click here on this name, it's kind of funny sometimes. You don't want to, you got to click and then kind of double click. Actually, we'll just kind of double click and you'll see how that layer lights up. So I choose my layer and then I just double click on that name, and we'll just call this flag 2. So that's how we can rename our layers. Alright, I'm going to duplicate this layer again. So we'll duplicate layer. Don't need to rename it. And we can also just click and drag these layers down into our trash can. Now Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, they all have these little icons down here. The first one's always going to be a trash can, then we're always going to have a new layer. So we can create a new layer here just by clicking on this. And you'll see now that we have a layer ready to add information. So if I wanted to draw a circle here and fill it with an orange color, I could. And the checkerboard back there just means that that's the transparency of that layer. Another thing we can do with layers is we can add colors. So if we wanted to group, or we wanted to kind of isolate our layers or organize our layers with colors, we could do that. So if you kind of had your background layers here and we wanted to have all the background part of our image red, all I'm doing is right clicking on this, on the little layer here, and pulling down and choosing different colors. And now when we get into right clicking, there's a couple of things to just keep in mind. If we right click on a thumbnail, we're going to get a little different contextual menu drop down, and here you see we can kind of change it to small thumbnails and large thumbnails, which is the same thing as clicking up here and coming down to panel options. So once again, right clicking is much quicker. So if we right click on this thumbnail, we're going to get a set of options. If we right click on our layer mask, we'll get a different set of options. Here you can see that we can delete the layer mask, we can show, disable layer mask. That's what those big X's are for. And if we right click over here in our actual layer, we'll get a whole nother set of options that we can choose. So just remember that there's 3 places to click here on each layer: on the actual thumbnail, the layer mask, and then over here in the actual layer. And remember, we just double click on the name here to change the name. Alright, let's talk about layer opacity. If I click on this layer and I wanted some of that flag to show through, I can come up here into my opacity slider and just change the actual opacity of that layer. And another quick way of changing that opacity is to just click on the layer and actually just tap your number 2 key, your number 6 key, your number 8 key, and that will translate to a 20%. 5 key translates to 50%, 9 to 90, 0 indicates 100%. And that's a real quick way to go through and change your opacity when you need to. And I'm all about trying to make things quicker and quicker and quicker. Alright, if we want to change the stacking order of our layers, all we have to do is click on that layer and just drag it down, and you'll see that that line between layers lights up a little bit. See how that lights up? And that just means that we are going to be putting that layer right between the previous layer, the layer on top, and the layer on bottom. So we can change the stacking order of any of these. If we want to select multiple layers, we can hold down the Shift key and go up through our stack. If we don't want contiguous layers selected, we can hold down Command and kind of skip layers in between. So Command will select layers. So if I wanted to select this layer and select my layer down here, I would do that by holding down Command. So I'm going to click on this one and then Command click on the one below it, the one that I wanted below it. We can group layers. In other words, we can put them into little folders, and that's what this little third icon over down here is. So if we click on this little group button, you'll see that we'll have this little folder, and it has a little triangle here that we can toggle it open, shut it, or toggle it open. And we can rename these, so I'll just call this test group. And all we have to do is click on our layers and just drag them into that group. You'll kind of see how that lights up. Before, if we were going to drag it and place it underneath, that line lights up, but when we're going to actually drop it into a group, you'll see that whole square kind of light up. And then all we have to do is toggle it open. Okay, so now there's my two layers inside my group. And anytime we want to drag a file outside of that group, we just click on it, and we're going to drag down, and you'll see I'll drag it up here. You'll see when that line lights up that that means that you're dragging that outside of that group. Okay, we can move groups, we can delete them, so I'll just click on this group layer and I'll right click and say delete group. And now I want my circle on top of my flag, so I'll just click on that layer and drag it up above my flag. Alright, if we want to hide a layer, that's what this little eyeball is for. So we just click on that little eyeball and you see your layer doesn't delete it or anything, it just hides it. And sometimes you want to see layers, sometimes you'll have these layers on and you don't want to see a portion of your file, so that's a good way of turning on and turning off those different layers. Okay, and we can click over here, or we can just click and drag and it should turn on each one of these layers. So just clicking and dragging over here in this eyeball will turn those layers on and off. Now, one thing that Photoshop does when it first creates a file is it gives you a background layer, and that background is always locked. So if you ever want to change that background layer or name it or anything, all we have to do is double click on it. It will turn it into a new layer. We can name that however we want to. We'll click OK, and now you see that we have an actual layer, and that just is a way of converting that background layer into a layer. We can lock layers up here. That's what these little icons are. So we can lock the transparency of our pixels. So if we click on that, that'll lock the transparency. So I'll click on that. You'll see a little lock pops up. We can lock the image pixels so that you can't paint on the actual parts of it. So if I lock that and I come over here and I want to paint, you'll see that I have a little can't do that symbol. So we can choose to lock the layer so that we can't paint on it. We can lock the layer, lock the position, and leave painting on. So we can either lock both of them or just lock one, or we can just click on this lock over here and lock everything. So now I can't paint on it, I can't add pixels to it, I can't move it, I can't do anything with it. So if you're ever working on a layer and you're frustrated and you just can't do anything to it, you can't select it or anything, then make sure that you kind of look over here and see if that lock is turned on or turned off. So I'm going to go ahead and unlock everything on that layer. Alright, we probably need to talk about layer masks. Those are actual layers that we can turn on and turn off and show and hide. So if I wanted to hide part of this circle here, what I would want to do is I want to come down here. This is my layer. I want to come down to this little icon here right next to the FX, and I'm going to click on it. It says Add Layer Mask. So I'll click on it there, and you'll see nothing happened. And that's simply because white is filled in with my layer mask here. Now if I were to fill that with black, you'll see that my circle is hidden. I didn't delete it, I didn't erase it or anything, all I did was hide it. So black conceals and white reveals. So if your layer mask is filled with black, that's why you can't see your object. Now we can use our selection tools and just hide portions of this if we wanted to. So if I wanted to create a circle here or an ellipse and I wanted to hide this part, let's just zoom this up. I'm going to turn off mini bridge. So if I wanted to hide this, if I fill this with black, I am going to hide this part of that orange circle. So I'll come over here and I'll click with my tool, make sure that layer mask is selected, and then I'm just going to let's just try, see if we can't fill it. I'll go Edit and I'll say Fill, and I'll bring up this little fill box, and I can choose either black, white, 50% gray. I want to choose black. So now you'll see over here that my mask, my layer mask, has this black ellipse because I filled this this selection up with that black, and so that's what's hiding. And I can turn that on and turn that off. Remember when we were right clicking? So I'm not going to right click on this thumbnail, I'm going to right click on this layer mask, and it says to disable that layer mask. And you'll see the X goes in there, and we see that our actual orange circle is back to normal. See, we didn't delete anything, all we're doing is hiding. So I'll right click on that and I'll say Enable Layer Mask. We can delete the layer mask, so if we were to delete it, it would be gone. If we wanted to apply the layer mask, in other words, we are comfortable with that layer mask and we want to go ahead and make it apply it, we can just right click and say Apply Layer Mask, and now you see that our layer mask goes away, and we have actually now told Photoshop to go ahead and get rid of that information, so I can't bring that up. And that's the nice thing about layer mask, is that they are non-destructive. As long as we keep that layer mask there, we can add to it. So if I were to wanted to eat away some more, I'm going to make my selections. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on my layer mask. I'll go Edit, Fill. We'll fill with black. And now you'll see that those selections are hiding part of that orange circle now. And we see it right over here. And if we option click on our layer mask, we'll actually see the layer mask up here in our document window. So option clicking shows and hides the actual mask. We can shift click to hide and reveal the mask. We can right click to delete, to apply, or disable. We can actually even add mask to selection, so we can kind of start adding selections if we want to. Alright, and let's go back to grouping a little bit. If I wanted to shift, I'm going to shift click on these, and I'm going to hit Command Group on a Mac, or Command G. That puts it into a group. We can also apply layer masks to our groups. So if we have a set of 4, 5, 6, 10 images, 2 images, 1 image inside a group, we can also add a layer mask to that actual group. Now, it disappeared because we have black in our layer mask, right? If I fill that with white, our layer mask, or our images come back. And once again, if we were to make a selection here, and we fill that with black, now our part of that image has gone away, or part of both of those layers are being masked in combination. Alright, we touched on layer effects, but we probably ought to talk about that a little more. I'm going to go ahead and shift click on this layer mask for my group, and I'll close it. And actually I'm going to go ahead and open it. Let's say we wanted to create a drop shadow underneath our orange circle here. I can click on that layer and pull down here to Effects. I'll click on it, and you'll see that we have all these little different layer effects that we can apply to each layer. And we'll come in here and we'll look for drop shadow. It's down here at the bottom, and just by checking it doesn't really give you any kind of options over here for drop shadow. We actually have to click on the word, and then we'll see that options appear for us. And just for drop shadow, we have opacity that we can change. We can change the blending modes. We can actually change the angle from where that sun is supposedly shining from. We can change the distance, so as we change that distance up, our drop shadow pulls away from our actual object. We can change the size of it, which is softening, and we can change the contours. And especially on this drop shadow one, and some of these others we can do this as well. We can actually come over here and click inside of our document window and actually move the drop shadow where we want to, and kind of have a more interactive experience with that drop shadow. So some of them work that way, some of them don't. And we can add multiple effects to our layer if we want to. We can add them all, kind of see what it's going to do. And all we have to do is just check or uncheck these little boxes. And like I said, if you want to interact, say, with bevel and emboss, just by checking it doesn't mean that you're interacting with it over here. You want to click on the actual name, and then the dialog boxes will change over here. And then we could change kind of the depth of our bevel, whether it's up and down. So we can kind of have some fun with these effects. We can hide the effects if we want to. We can move the effects if we want to. So if I wanted to take this effect and apply it down to this layer, it's not going to do much, but I can do that. Let's go ahead and create a new layer so that you can actually kind of see this. So I'm going to click on my new layer icon down here. We will draw out a square, and I'm going to fill that with white real quick, so that we can kind of see the effect of this. So if I have a layer effect, I can drag it from layer to layer. So all I have to do is just click on that and drag it up. And if I want to duplicate it, in other words, I want it on this orange layer and my white layer, I'm going to fill that with a different color for you. Change that to a green. And if I wanted to duplicate this layer effect, all I have to do is hold down Option and drag that up to that new layer, and I've got the same layer effect now that I had on my orange circle. And once again, we can turn off either the whole entire effect, or we could just turn off the drop shadow if we want to and leave the bevel and emboss, or we could turn off the bevel and emboss and turn on the drop shadow. Another thing that we can do with layers, let's say we wanted to keep the positioning of this green square in relationship to this orange circle shape that we have. Well, we can actually link layers together so that if I move the green layer my orange layer is automatically going to move. And how we do that is we're going to just click on a layer, my green square, my rectangle, and then I'm going to hold down Shift to select the orange layer. And I'll just come down here. I don't know if we can right click. I think we can. Yes, we can right click and say link layers. Or we can come down here to our little icons and you'll see this little chain link button. And if I click on that, you'll see that chain link is associated with those two layers. Now if I select either one of these layers and move it, the other layer automatically moves with it because they're linked together. And if I choose my orange layer and move it, they're going to move together. Kind of like grouping, but not actually grouping. And then if you ever want to unlink, we'll just come down here and click the link, and you'll see that those link icons go away. And this little FX button, this little triangle, that's how we can kind of show or hide our actual layer effects. Sometimes it's nice to keep things clean. If you've got a lot of layers, I tend to leave them turned open just so that I can kind of see what's going on. And remember, you can click and drag this layers panel if you need more information. We can either drag it left and right, or we can actually drag it up and down and make it bigger. And all I'm doing is clicking on this little dotted bar down here and clicking and dragging. Alright? Well, I think that's going to get us through the first stage of layers. There's much more to talk about, but I will try to do that in the next video tutorial. So thanks for watching, and I will see you down the road in yet another tutorial on Photoshop.